I put scotch in there for you. That's quite a nice gallery.
Yeah.
Maybe you probably just built some suspense because we had to kill the first one.
That's true.
Yeah.
Probably the Australians just wouldn't know that I'm not live. I'm nearly dead.
So are you putting out what you say about the Lulu report today?
We will probably I will put mine out up on a Monday, but our analysts will do something probably later today. Yeah. I think so. You should. As fast as they think they can get through it.
It's a long report, so
Yeah.
you need to read all the pieces.
But a lot of it's redacted, so it's not really 400 pages.
Well, I don't know how much is redacted.
What I saw so far, it looked like probably about a quarter, but I couldn't really tell. Again, I only read the first 30, 40 pages. So.
Good afternoon. We have a very full house and a wonderful program ahead of us. I am Lulu Wang, Asia Society Vice Chair and a founder of Asia Society Policy Institute, otherwise known as ASPI. Before I go into introducing Kevin, I'd like to introduce our two outstanding speakers who will be in conversation with Kevin this afternoon. We have with us Dr. Graham Allison, who is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard's JFK School and former director of Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Graham has served as special advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan and Assistant Secretary of Defense and Plans under President Clinton. He's the author of many best-selling books, but his latest, has created a great deal of interest, and it is entitled Destined for War? Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? We also are honored to have Ian Bremmer, who is our Howard Newman Distinguished Fellow in Geopolitics at ASPI. We have Hal Newman here with us. But just as importantly, he is president and founder of the Eurasia Group. He's also the president and founder of G0 Media, a Eurasia Group company that is dedicated to helping a broad and global audience make sense of today's challenging populist world. Ian is a prolific thought leader, author, and noted lecturer. He is author of several books as well, and his latest is entitled Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. Today's event will begin with conversations among our three speakers, followed by Q&A with our audience. For those of you watching the event via webcast, if you have questions for the panel, please tweet them using hashtag Asia Society Live. For those of you who are here in person, you're most welcome to live tweet the program, and we just ask you to silence your phones. And now a few words about Kevin. Many of you were here last year when we gathered for a discussion for the first volume of Kevin's autobiography, Not for the Faint of Heart, Not Faint-Hearted. Today's conversation will cover the next phase of Kevin's life, providing a deep dive into his time in office, dealing on his domestic and international activities. And some of that has been characterized by his own words, the coup that killed Australia politics. But also, very importantly, his leadership during very turbulent times. There is so much to tell you about Kevin, so I'll try to be fairly brief and then introduce you to the real McCoy. Kevin began his career as a China scholar before becoming an Australian diplomat posted in Beijing. After his time there, Kevin entered Australian politics and twice rose up to become Australia's Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010 and again in 2013. And he also served his country as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012. On the global front, Kevin was very active and very impactful. He led Australia's response during the global financial crisis, which was reviewed by the IMF as the most effective stimulus strategy of all member states. Kevin also co-founded G20 to drive the global response to the crisis, which in 2009 helped to prevent the crisis from spiraling into further depression. On a matter very close to his heart, climate matters, Kevin ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 2007 and legislated in 2008 for a 20% mandatory renewable energy target for Australia. He was also appointed a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. His government saw a near doubling of Australia's foreign aid budget to approximately $5 billion, making Australia then one of the top 10 aid donors, certainly a seat at the table. On the domestic front, Kevin was equally effective. He, very importantly, delivered Australia's formal national apology to the Indigenous Australians, another example of his great humanitarian character. In education, his government introduced Australia's first ever nationwide school curriculum and undertook the biggest ever capital investment program in Australian schools. On health, in 2010, he negotiated a National Health and Hospitals Reform Agreement, the biggest reform and investment in the Australian health system. And in 2010, his government introduced Australia's first ever paid parental scheme and implemented the biggest increase in and reform of the age pension since Federation. So it's very apparent, even from my sharing with you a little of what he has done in his years in service, he has truly transformed every institution and every initiative to which he has been committed. So it's very clear to all of us, Kevin is a visionary, and in being so, he also was a dreamer. But in addition to his being a dreamer, he was also a constructive realist. And whether it was to do with nations, his eternal hope that US and China will find common ground, or with people, his ability to accept setbacks and yet not lose his confidence in the faith, loyalty, and trust of people. And this has been returned to him in spades. There's so much more to say about Kevin, but let me now give the dais over to Kevin and our guests. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
So it's a conversation, but Kevin said I have to sort of facilitate, so I'm going to do that. First of all, it's such a pleasure. Everybody that knows Kevin knows what a wonderful human being he is, except for the people that don't like him in Australia. But everyone else does. I didn't know that. When I first met him, I thought he was awesome. And of course, when you meet Australians, and you say that Kevin is one of your besties, it can go very well. But it needn't. But maybe I should start with that, because today's a pretty interesting day in the U.S. too, right? I mean, we had some pretty extraordinary morning with the Attorney General first and the press conference, and now in the last hour and a half, we've had the dropping of the redacted version of the Mueller report. I spent 15 minutes in the subway starting to read it up. It's going to take the whole weekend, right? But though not as long as this. By 200 pages, this is longer. I think we should start by asking Kevin, because not many of us here really know Australia, but a lot of us here kind of feel like we're experiencing all this in the U.S. As someone who has been through one of the more divisive periods of political conflict domestically in Australia, and now has seen it play out here in Washington, where you're no stranger, how's it different? What are the lessons? How do you think about the American political system in the context of what you've been through as PM twice?
Yeah. Well, thank you both for being here, by the way. And I'll try and avoid that question.
I'll just ask it again, Kevin.
That's right. Did your mother give you those socks? Or?
Nope. No. I picked these out myself just for you. I wore a suit for you today.
It shows you picked those socks out yourself. You can't see Ian's socks. They'll be on display later. One of the museum exhibits downstairs.
This is the only time I've ever seen him in a suit, so this is a sign of honor.
It is, absolutely.
Thank you all for being here for this book party to do with my own autobiography. And for those of you who've chosen not to be at home and reading the Mueller report line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and trying to work out and deduce what the redacted parts really said, thank you for choosing to be here instead. Well, in America, I think I've discovered, having now lived among you for the last several years, that you really do conduct your politics almost as brutally as we do in Australia. That of itself is no bad thing. Your democracy, like ours, is very much an in-your-face democracy. And there's a great virtue to that structurally, because a lot of political systems, frustrations simply erupt, and often violently. In our systems, however robust and occasionally comical they may look, they're basically conducted vicariously through the cut and thrust, sometimes with a broadsword, sometimes with a stiletto, often lethal. But by and large, the body politic remains peaceful. And that's no small thing. And with the Mueller report today, as you said earlier in conversation with me, it really is a triumph of the democratic process that it's out there, however redacted it is, because I'm sure someone will leak the full report sooner or later. If your system's ultimately like ours, that's what will happen. In terms of the commonalities between American politics and Australian politics, let me say something a little controversial. There is one big force which is a giant shaping factor in the politics of this country and the politics of my own. And that's Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch has a huge impact on Australian politics. He owns 70% of our print newspapers, now owns a television station as well. And so whether you like him or loathe him, the bottom line is, and I tend to be more in the latter category, what happens is that it really does fundamentally shape the nature of the political debate. In our country, he's given this consistent voice to the forces of what I describe as the right and the far right, and often ridiculing those from the centre and from the left, and creating a new polarisation in politics, which previously was not as sharp. When I look at what happens in this country and the megaphone of Fox News, or on the high road through the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, which Rupert also owns, I see a similar force at work. And it actually encourages shall I say, a more polarised and vicious political debate than would necessarily otherwise be the case. And in my case, if you read the chapters of this book, certainly one of my principal political enemies in Australian politics was the forces of the Murdoch media for a whole range of reasons, both ideological, policy, and to some extent personality-wise as well. So if there is a common factor between our two democracies and where they're going, it's the deep impact of the Murdoch media on the way in which our respective democracies conduct their national politics. I see the permanent representative of Canada here, so Marc-André. I said this to a friend recently. What's the difference between Canadian, Australian and American politics? Well, Canadian politics is generally less vicious, still in your face. But the big difference between our three English-speaking democracies is that Murdoch ain't there. When I look at British politics, and Murdoch is there in spades, who campaigned in support of Brexit? Rupert Murdoch. Who for a season campaigned in support of Scottish independence? Rupert Murdoch. And if you look at the forces alive in British politics doing this the whole time, it's a big factor. It's not the only common factor between our various English-speaking democracies, but it's a big one. And I think would be wrong of us to simply skip over it.
When you
I
met
think,
with...
if I make one comment, I think that your point is the biggest point, but I'd make a small point as a political scientist. So looking at political systems, I think the most peculiar thing about Australian democratic politics is that a leader is more likely to be stabbed in the back by one of his colleagues than in the front by his political opponent. So Kevin was prime minister, and lo and behold, he wakes up one day and he's been stabbed by, what's her name, Gillian.
Julia Gillard. Yeah.
And he's out, okay? And then, lo and behold, she says to him, well, okay, you can be foreign minister. Then again, he's prime minister and again stabbed. So I think that if I look at it, Australia in recent times looks almost like Italian politics, whereas when I studied a long time ago, I thought Australia was like Canada.
Well, I'll take those two blows to the solar plexus head on. On the question of being knifed in the back, well, that's been around since Caesar, and it's didn't turn out well for Julius either. Never go to the Forum on a Thursday. But always bear in mind Churchill's great observation. You know, the backbencher meets Churchill and says, well, now I'm sitting for the first time in the House of Commons. It's great to be able to stare the enemy in the face. And he said, oh, my dear chap, those aren't the enemy, that's the opposition. The enemy is sitting behind us. So this is not, shall we say, sui generis to Australian politics. It's kind of somewhat of a case universal. But there is an element of significant truth in what Graham has had to say. And it's this. Up until recently in Australian political life, in both our major political parties, essentially the parliamentary leader, in my case the Australian Labor Party, was there purely on the basis of the floating sentiment of your fellow members of parliament in your party. And so that became ultimately very destabilising for our side of politics. So when I came back as Prime Minister in 2013, as detailed in the book, I changed the rules so that now we have a hybrid system. To remove a political leader in our party, it's now a 50% vote of the parliamentary party, but 50% of the entire national membership of the party, which means that you cannot conduct a midnight political coup anymore. And the result of which is my successor as leader of the Australian Labor Party, who's likely to be elected as Prime Minister when our national elections finish on March 18, just next month. He's been in office now for 6 years. He's my successor. No challenge, because the rules actually have created that stability. Our Conservative opponents didn't bring in those rules. They've had 3 Prime Ministers since then, 3 leaders of the Conservative Party. So rules actually make a difference. So we've kind of stabilised our side of the shop. I think the Conservatives will probably do the same. But I'll take the Italian comparison on notice and I'll repay you later.
Just to do one short advertisement for the book here, I would say the book is full of a lot of juicy stories. And one of that I like especially was Kevin is Prime Minister and he goes to China and lo and behold, he's been stabbed in the back and so he's no longer Prime Minister. And then they announce he's Foreign Minister. And some guys drag him up in front of a press conference. And the guy from Beijing TV1 says, but Kevin, you're still alive. And he says, yes, I'm still here. I have not yet gone to meet Marx.
You know, coups have a different meaning in China. So go
The
back.
standard Chinese term for death is 你去看马克思, which is you're off to see Marx. That's bye-bye. So our Chinese friends, when I arrived in Beijing, having been deposed but rehabilitated, was, what happened? You should be dead. Anyway.
So going back to the Mueller comparison, what is the part of this book, the part of your life as PM, that you most struggled with considering redacting as you were putting this together?
Oh. Or maybe, what did you redact as well?
That's next. That's next. First, something that's here that he struggled. Then he'll give us a little tidbit of what he actually redacted after.
Gee, that's what you get for inviting friends on this platform.
You want me to sit behind you? Is that what you're saying?
The bottom line is, Gillian, the Australian ambassador, is here with us. You don't actually get away with much in Australian public life without actually ending up out there. There's only 25 million of us, okay? It's pretty difficult to keep a secret with a family that size. You're much better at it in America, at least for a season. So I don't think this is a pretty candid account of what went on. In terms of what you redact yourself voluntarily, I suppose when conversations are deeply private, which you've had with people over the course of your political life, which would be problematic. So that's something which I think we all bear in mind when we write books about periods of our political life, our public life, or our professional life. But in terms of going back to your Mueller analogy, and only having read the BBC sort of summary of what's in the Mueller report, I think I could fairly say this, and with deference to all Republicans in this gathering here today, if I as Prime Minister did 10% of what the Trumpster is alleged to have done in this report, you'd be out of office. It's kind of quite spectacular in terms of the amount of, let's call it, attempted obstruction of justice, which the president seems to engage in. It just wouldn't wash in our country. You'd be, well, simply through the operation of freedom of information laws in Australia, it would not be able to be done that way. So, which, going back to the strength of the American system, is whatever you think of the president, and I am on the record as having supported a number of the things that he sought to do in foreign policy, including in relation to the China relationship. But in your system, despite all the criticism which Americans make of the state of your own democracy, it's a strength of your democracy that all this stuff is out there. And now the American people make up their mind as whether it's significant or whether it's not, whether it's just something for within the Beltway or whether it's actually real about the caliber of person that you want occupying the position of Commander-in-Chief.
Did it feel like a strength of the Australian system, given how much of it did immediately become public, given how, and how personalized the battles were, both in the media as well as within the party?
Look, I take a very simple view that if you think, any of you think, that politics is your future vocation, be very careful in your reflections in our respective democracies, because nothing is private anymore. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so, therefore, embark upon your mission with the discomforting knowledge that your entire life, past and future, will be out there before the public. So, you know, going into public life, I thought I was pretty happy about all that. And then being in public life, I was not so happy about all that. And then at the end of my time there, you develop such a layer of scar tissue that perhaps you become inured to it.
I'm not going to ask you to show that off, but I am going to say, before we go to international, I want to give you an easier question, which is looking...
How did I go on the hard question?
Back.
Thank you.
Yes. Looking back from 2019, if you want to talk about legacy and the thing for Australia that is enduring, that you are most pleased with, proud of, because it's rare that you get to talk to somebody that actually made a real difference in a country going forward, what would you now say that is?
For me, it was the crisis I didn't expect, which was the global financial crisis. Many of you here are from finance. You know how existential that all got back in 2008. Try running a middle-sized economy, which is globally dependent on international capital flows. It's pretty existential. And was this in my kind of to-do list when I was elected about a year before that? Nope. So the thing I'm most proud of is, having seen how existential this thing was, to frankly get the troops together and devise a financial policy, a fiscal policy, and a monetary policy with the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is an independent entity, to bring about a set of measures which stopped the economy from crashing into recession or something worse. Because I'm a working class kid. I grew up on a farm. Father had never been to high school. Mum, not much either. But both of them being children of the Great Depression, I was brought up on these stories of what it was like in the Great Depression in the 1930s in Australia. Like not enough food to eat, and certainly nothing that looked like a job in prospect. So for me, the animating value was not being prepared to stand idly by while 500,000 or 1 million Australians were thrown into unemployment. That for me was the big question. So we rolled out a stimulus package of 5.8% of GDP, one of the largest in the OECD. But we structured it in a manner which I'm very proud of, sort of quarter by quarter, year by year, over a 2.5-year period, which actually kept us out of recession. And so, literally, 500,000 families who would have been thrown onto the scrap heap of life. The parallel thing I'm most proud of is realising that, whatever you do nationally as a middle-sized economy is ultimately irrelevant unless the rest of the world's acting, was being a real international activist in ensuring we could create not just the G20, but also through that mechanism get the Chinese and the rest of the large economies in the world to stimulate as well. And we did that through the London conference of March 2009. So put those national measures together with what we were able to do.
Probably the best, most effective G20 since it's been organized.
Yeah, that's true.
That meeting.
Those two things, when I look back on it, and given that we all have only partial information at the time, you know what it's like? It's like staring through a glass dimly. Is saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're not going to allow a recession if we can possibly avoid it, and we're going to try and mobilise the rest of the world to stimulate. I'm pretty proud about the results.
So let me underline 2 points here, because they're both of these events are described in the book with a lot of interesting detail, because you get to see it through Kevin's eyes. But for context, with respect to the 2008 financial crisis, especially for younger people, you can't even remember what it was. This was the biggest financial crisis that had been seen globally since the Great Depression. This is 2008, and many people were thinking we were destined for a Great Depression. And the Great Depression was what we were talking about. And actually, the bets in the market were like this and like that. So it was very, very one side or the other. The only major economy that did not go into recession, so U.S. had minus 7%, I think, the first year. Only economy that didn't go into recession was the Australian economy. So that's a pretty amazing thing. The other thing is that I never understood is how did we end up with the G20? And so Kevin explains this. So as an Australian, he knew that whatever the G number was, it had to include Australia. So G7.
Because that's a universal principle for everybody.
G7, Australia doesn't make it. How about 10? It's still not there. It's the 12th largest economy at the time that this debate goes on. And I asked him before, well, why 20? And he said, well, maybe our share of GDP is going to shrink, and so we want to have a little leeway.
That's right. I was building in future buffer.
It was always funny at Davos when the Polish government was the most agitated about the G20's structure because they were 21. And they just hated that. So, but legitimately, you could make an argument, a reasonable argument, that table in London with those 20 leaders was probably the most important global confab single meeting that has occurred since we put the UN together.
It was an extraordinary meeting.
Talk a little bit about you being in that room and how you felt and who you talked to and what it was like and what you learned.
Well, the night before the formal meeting, Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister, invited us round to number 10. And if you've been to number 10 before, it's not all that big, actually. It's quite a small building. It's kind of an 18th century house dressed up as a Prime Minister's residence and office. So it's a rabbit warren once you get inside it. Anyway, we're in this dining room, which is a small room. And there are 20 of us around the table, and so G20. And so I'm sitting here, Brown's there, Hu Jintao's over there, Obama's sitting next to him, I think Merkel over here. And what struck me most about the dinner, as we all sat down, was the look in everyone's eyeballs, which was along the lines of, this is really bad. And then the second political thought in their heads is, so bad, we mightn't be here next year ourselves, whatever political system we came from. And so Gordon opened things up. And a lot of people have been critical of Gordon Brown's time as Prime Minister. I've got to say, the amount of intellectual effort he put into the orchestration of that G20 and the behind-the-scenes drafting work between Britain, the United States, Germany, China, and us, the Australians. There are 5 of us who actually drafted the communique, and which committed everyone to the action points necessary, including the level of global stimulus. Brown was actually essential to what went on. My simple remark around the table, which was quoted back to me 5 years later by the Chinese, was, okay guys, here we are in London. Last time we all gathered like this was in 1933 actually. It was called the London Conference to deal with the Great Crash. Okay. And we came from far and wide, and what happened then was that no agreement was reached, and everyone went back home and took what was by then a big recession globally, applied massive levels of protectionism to their national economies, and turned a global recession into an enduring depression. And you don't have to know much history to know what then happened with the political radicalization of Europe, which occurred during the 30s, the rise of Nazism, etc. I said, so that's option A for us. We can repeat what happened when everyone gathered here last time round. So, and I could see Hu Jintao with his interpreter sort of eyes go, barr, and I said, the alternative is we actually act together to make a difference. Because if we don't, the logic is pretty simple. What's begun as a financial crisis is about to become a systemic economic crisis affecting all of us. And if it becomes an economic crisis, it then becomes an employment crisis, which becomes a social crisis, which becomes a political crisis across all of our systems. So Hu Jintao quotes this back to me several years later as something which, as a phrase, kind of galvanized folks. But the real work was done by Gordon around the table. The funny thing in the actual room itself the next day was the brawl which broke out between the Chinese and the French. Sarkozy was president of France at the time. I don't know if you know much about Nicolas Sarkozy, but he's interesting. and he kind of erupts in a Gallic fashion. Not really following the detail of what's going on, but he suddenly got a bee in his bonnet about Anglo-Saxon tax havens. Now, I'm all on his side. I'm a social democrat. We don't like tax evasion. And so whether it's, the British Virgin Islands or whatever it is. But I said to Sarkozy in my high school French, and I only have, my Chinese is okay, but my French is terrible. I said, because he didn't speak much English, still doesn't speak much English.
No,
I said, it's not the occasion for this. We're actually just trying to survive. Let's deal with tax havens next year, after we've managed to survive this year. No. Pas du tout. Pas du tout. And so, of course, he was up against the British because of their own tax havens. He was up against some American interests as well. But of course, the Chinese had Macau, which was being used for these sorts of purposes as well. So suddenly, we're trying to kind of save the global economy. We've got this kind of, battle emerging within the ranks of what I thought was a third-order issue, which then turned into a three-way conversation between Obama and Hu Jintao and Sarkozy and me, because I had high school French and I spoke Chinese. Like there's no one else in the room. It's only principals. Like there's no one there.
No translators.
No, because they were all outside.
Right, yeah.
So whatever we agreed, I'm not quite sure, because they were relying upon my French, we managed to calm it down. And in the end, the communique was delivered. And if you look, this is really interesting. Sometimes you think blah, 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 another international conference would ever happen. I've been watching the evolution of the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom and how many times Theresa May's gone off to Brussels for yet another meeting for something else on the Brexit debate. Everyone tunes out. Every now and then there is a global conference which matters. This was one, because on the day after this conference in March, April of 2009, financial markets finally did this. They bottomed, and then they did that. And if you look at the trajectory between recession and depression, that was the meeting that did it. I played a small part. Gordon Brown played a much bigger part.
So, final question around the book before we turn to China, where we can, because I want to get both of you guys in on this, which is, what's the thing that when you were prime minister, you were completely convinced, okay, this is going to happen in the world, and looking back on it from 2019, you're saying to yourself, nope, I got that wrong. That is not the way the world worked.
I think when I went steaming off to the Copenhagen conference on climate change in December of 2009, and being wide-eyed in my level of optimism that we could, through the power of reason and a bit of cajolery, get the international community across the line to agree on a major global compact on climate. And then, sitting in the room with the G20 leaders...
Were the Chinese in that room or no?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story in itself, because, I'd been in the White House talking to Obama before this happened, because I was kind of acting as a bit of a shop steward. Do you know what that is?
Someone that runs the shop?
Well, in trade union terms, it's like an organizer.
I was just a guess. I was just throwing it out there, Okay.
So I was just trying to pull the pieces together. So
You're a social democrat. So
I'm a social democrat. So I go off and see Obama and I said, look, we're going to have this conference.
That's why you don't like the Sox, by the way. I think that's
right.
the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're blue, they're not red.
Yeah.
And they're stripy and lacking in taste. But we're friends. At least we were. And so I go up to Obama and say, look, this is a serious conference. It's in the balance. We need you there. And at this stage it was like this as to whether Hillary would go, whether he would go. And so I said, we really need you there. And so we get to Copenhagen, no Obama, and I'm saying, oh my God, here we go. And then the Chinese and the Indians are acting up something ferocious, trying to slow the whole process down, ultimately kill it, because as the major developing world polluters, they did not want to be put into the public spotlight, to bring about their own reductions in greenhouse gases, because they were just beginning on the development curve. And so then the 5th Cavalry arrives. Obama walks in the room, and I think, problem solved. The Yanks have come. You can see the cavalry coming across the hill, and you could see the others' reaction in the room was, okay, the Nobel Peace Laureate has come, because he just got the Nobel Prize for being elected, remember? And frankly, if I was an African American, I'd just been elected, given the politics of this country, I think I would have deserved the Nobel Peace Prize too. Good on him, that's what I say. Anyway.
That's probably the most controversial thing you've said so far today, so, yeah.
No, I mean it.
No, I know, that's why I'm saying it's controversial.
Yeah,
exactly.
I do. But we get there, and so suddenly the negotiations start to go somewhere. But the Chinese, led by Wen Jiabao, the then premier, refused to attend the negotiating session because it's not on the formal protocol list of formal engagements for the Chinese delegation. In other words, it's an excuse, a diplomatic excuse. Any of you who've been at these global meetings, you know, frankly, it's a series of rolling informal meetings trying to reach a consensus amongst the principal countries, which the rest of the international community can then get behind. Sometimes called the green room. And so they send me to talk to Wen Jiabao to try and get him into the room. It was hilarious. And this is just after a state dinner hosted by the Queen of Denmark. And I'm sitting next to Princess Mary, thank you. She's an Australian. She's going to be the next Queen of Denmark, so watch out for it, folks. Anyway, so I get sitting to talk to Wen Jiabao. And I say, oh, g'day, Premier Wen, how's it going? How's the family? Everything going well? You know, had a good trip getting here? And everything good? Yeah. I said, we're just about to have a little chat, actually, the rest of us, about the Copenhagen Accord on climate change. And President Obama's going to be there, Merkel's going to be there, go down the list. I said, it'd be great if you were there, you know, it's just so important. And he said, 不行, Chinese for no way. And, or literally, it doesn't walk. And this was all in Chinese. And I said, but everyone else is there. And, you know, China's not there. It's just going to be impossible for us to reach an agreement. He said, 没有人告诉我. He said, no one's told me. I said, but I'm telling you. He said, yeah, but you're not Danish. And I said, that's true, I'm not Danish. You know, but the Danes and others have asked me to come and talk to you. He said, so 破坏礼宾秩序, which is it destroys the order of protocol. And I'm thinking, this guy's looking for any reason not to be at this discussion. So I failed. So we had a low-ranking Chinese, actually a good friend of mine, he was the Vice Foreign Minister at the time, who then sat through these negotiations, reluctantly agreed to our Copenhagen Accord, but the Chinese instructions from on high was that when we'd agreed on the Copenhagen Accord in the room, which was very similar to what then became the Paris Agreement of 2015, the Chinese and the Indians then took to the conference floor so that when we sought to formally gavel this agreement into reality, the Chinese and the Indians and their proxies then destroyed it.
Mm-hmm. So what if I'm going to push a little harder here, because I assume everyone here finds this pretty fascinating, right? Yeah. So you're a China hand. I mean, in fact, known globally as one of the most incisive analytically on China. What surprised you? What did you miss? Because they came in and obviously were far less prepared. And I think the world thought this was going to be a big breakthrough meeting, not just you. What did you miss about their intentions from when they were showing up, from when everyone was prepping all this stuff?
What I missed and failed to analyse was their own internal timetable for action. The Chinese had already produced their own green paper on climate change domestically, which we'd read, and so we thought they'd got the script. We thought they'd understood where all this was going. But their timetable for domestic adjustment to climate change action was still several years away. And so what we were doing through this conference in 2009 was actually pressing the accelerator forward by 2 or 3 years, which they weren't ready for. The second thing we missed was that because this was a fast-flowing negotiation, that the way in which Chinese central politics works is you have a agreed position from the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Chinese officials go out there and negotiate that to the point of their remit, beyond which the political representative at the conference concerned cannot go. In our systems of government and democratic systems of government, we have more flexibility. We've still got to answer to our cabinets and our parliaments, but we negotiate. Their system is, when the head of government or the head of the party is with you in international negotiation, it's already supposed to be agreed, which is part of the Trumpsters' dilemma with these trade negotiations. If Donald Trump thinks he can go to Mar-a-Lago with President Xi Jinping and apply some special Trump magic to negotiate the remaining 1/3 of this agreement, Donald Trump's got another thing coming. It doesn't work that way in the Chinese system. They would never expose their political leaders to that level of political risk of failure. It has to be done beforehand.
And that's a Copenhagen problem.
And so that was my problem in Copenhagen. So that's what I got radically wrong. And back home in Australia paid the consequences because, the Australian public believed that somehow people like me could pull off a bunch of magic in Copenhagen, and I wasn't able to do so.
Okay, so everyone has to buy the book, right? And by the way, carbon neutral. Kevin is planting a tree for everyone that you buy, which you need to because it's big. But let me go to let me go to China. And now, in addition to Kevin, I'm Graham Allison, who I as a young political scientist. This guy was dean of the Kennedy School and wrote one of the Essence of Decision was the definitive book for political scientists to understand how international relations was sort of conducted. Now another definitive book on the Thucydides trap, very relevant to the negotiations we're having right now. Talk about how you think the Trump administration and the Chinese are managing this smaller deal in the context of the broader structural concerns that your latest book is about.
Well, a big question. Let me make one small aside on the previous subject.
This is all about asides.
So this
yeah.
basically, I think, you did a great job pushing Kevin down on a few of or poking deeply into a few things. But most of you know what an asset you have here at the Asia Society to have somebody like Kevin. But I suspect if I were to give a quiz on what is Australia, you might be hard-pressed. So let me try a few questions just to see. So Australia...
It's a hell of an aside, but okay, we're doing this.
We're on it. Graham's in charge.
1 minute.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Australia is an island off the coast of China. True or false?
True.
Okay.
Oh.
Yes and no. Okay. So it is an island off the coast of China, but about the size of a continent, namely about the size of a continental U.S. So how many people does Australia have? So Australia has about as many people as Taiwan. And compared to Shanghai, 30% less. 30% fewer. Shanghai's bigger than. So Australians speak English.
Sort of.
Yes or no? Okay. So obviously with an interesting accent and with a lot of words that we don't use.
Yours is cute too.
Well, I would say it's English with an Australian twist, but with a twinkle in the eye, and also a lot of words that we don't use. So most of you, or if you're a good friend of Kevin's, sometimes he calls you mate. Oh, I'm sure Ian is mate. And I remember when we had him at Harvard, where I was trying to keep him mate. I was thinking, what is mate? Okay, so I go look in Australia. A mate in Australian is a person with whom you would share the last beer in the six-pack. And in 2018, Joe Dumford, who's the chairman of the JCS, announced, and this is relevant for our West Point folks, he announced that we have a special mateship, that's what he called it, announcing that on the 100th anniversary last year of the first time Australians and Americans fought together side by side in World War I, that every war since then in which Americans have fought, Australians have fought right beside them. And they're the only ally of which that's the case. So this relationship is called a special mateship. So there's your lessons for Australia for the day. So back to Ian's question. So I think the Trump administration is symptomatic of a much larger drama that we're seeing. The larger drama is the one described by Thucydides, which I try to make clear for us in the current context. But Thucydides wrote about this brilliantly 2,500 years ago. And his storyline is that when a rising power, like Athens, threatens to displace a ruling power, like Sparta, which had been the ruler of the Greece for 100 years, alarm bells should sound. Extreme danger ahead. People will be alarmed. Their perceptions will often become misperceptions, and they'll be extremely vulnerable to external shocks or third-party actions that produce a result that they don't want. So in the Trump administration, you can see this waking up, and then you're actually seeing it across the whole spectrum, politically, as we were talking before, and across the policy spectrum. You think, holy Moses, where did this thing come from? China is now big, strong, and rivaling the U.S. in virtually every dimension. Americans don't like that. That's who we are. So for Americans whose conception of the USA is number one, Chinese encroachment on our, as we think of it, prerogatives and positions that we've enjoyed for 100 years of the American century is an affront. And that is now playing through in the different dimensions. One that's very symptomatic is the trade conflict. But I think, as you've written, Ian, and I certainly agree, this will get resolved by what will be declared to be a great successful negotiation. I think that'll happen in the next couple of months. And it will resolve in a limited degree, a limited amount of the competition or rivalry. But it'll be a temporary thing. I think actually it'll only do part of the issues that they're even negotiating about. So they'll say, we're continuing to negotiate about the other items. And this is one of 100 dimensions. So the rivalry in high tech, the idea that a Chinese company like Huawei could be ahead of the US in 5G? Well, excuse me, they are. Well, how did this happen? Well, they must have stolen it. Well, of course, it's difficult to steal something from somebody who doesn't have it. So that's a little complicated. But
they're sneaky.
Well, in any case, they were sneaky. You know, there's some other thing going on here. This cannot be because we own high tech. High tech is who America is. If you look at the AI race, which I've been looking at carefully lately, if you go to China, they don't use credit cards anymore in the big cities. Credit card? What's credit card? Be like, paper money? What is paper money? That's not what they do. Their fintech is like a whole generation ahead of American fintech. Well, they must have stolen that from us. Well, that's also difficult since we don't have it. So if I know for sure I'm number one, and anytime you get close to me or even rival me or maybe surpass me on a dimension, that's a problem for me. That's a problem. And I think in this dynamic, which we see accelerating in the politics, trade is just one little piece of it.
So two things I need to ask you. I know you've been working with Kevin on and others on ideas for potential off-ramps so that we do not fall into a Thucydides trap where the U.S. and China end up at war. Of the off-ramps that you have been exploring so far, what is the one that you consider to be most doable / promising?
That's a good question. So
Well, that's why I asked.
the one that's most attractive, the one that I was working on in China 2 weeks ago with some Chinese colleagues is a combination of an idea that John Kennedy came to after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he said, we've got to settle for a world safe for diversity. That was his phrase. And I'll explain just a bit what that is. And a Chinese idea, which a Chinese scholar in Shanghai gave me and which I've been trying to study. I'm not a student of Chinese history, but in the Song dynasty, about 1,000 years ago, the Song were trying to deal with a northern Mongol tribe, the Liao, and they had a bunch of battles, but they couldn't defeat them. So they reached a treaty in 1005 in which they embodied what they called a rivalry partnership. So that sounds like a contradiction. I mean, it sort of is a contradiction. So they were ruthless rivals in some space, and they were partnering in other spaces. And that peace treaty only lasted for 120 years. Okay? But if you could sign up for 120 years right now, I'd sign up for that. So could you mush these two ideas together? So John Kennedy's idea was the following. He had just lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, most dangerous episode in recorded history. He thought he was about to kill a couple 100 million people in a nuclear annihilation. And when he thought about that in retrospect, he thinking, holy Moses, what did we do? How did this happen? And he would talk to his brother, Bobby, who was part of this. They were both Catholics, and they were asking themselves, if we go before the day of judgment, and we, the leaders responsible for killing, or partly responsible for killing a couple 100 million people,
It's probably purgatory. at that
probably
point.
doesn't
Yeah,
sound good,
that's right,
okay?
yeah,
Doesn't
yeah.
sound good. So thinking about that for a long time, he said in a famous speech at the American University, if you've never read this speech, the American University commencement speech, he says, we're not going to be able to settle all of our differences now. Us, free, good America, and evil empire Soviet Union. So we're going to have to instead build, quote, a world safe for diversity, bad guys and good guys alike, and we'll see how our system works, and we'll see how their system works, and we'll see how that works out. So there's one idea. You put that together with the rivalry partnership, you say, well, are the U.S. and China going to be fierce rivals in almost every domain? Of course we are. China just wants to be China. They want to make China great again. How could they not want to do that? And currently they have about a quarter the per capita GDP of Americans. We should tell them that's good enough. You should be happy with the quarter. No, they would like to have half the GDP per capita of Americans. Of course, that would give them twice as big a GDP as ours. And how about if they were 3/4 as productive as Americans? Oh my God, that's 3 times. I can't do that. I do defense budgets or life. No. So I would say they just want to do that. They'll continue trying to do that. This will be a fierce, uncomfortable, painful rivalry. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, if in that rivalry some third party's provocation in Taiwan and North Korea, whatever, drags the two of us into a war and we destroy everything, that didn't work out, so we got to be partners on that. On climate, Kevin's back to that. If Chinese don't constrain their greenhouse gases and we don't constrain ours, neither of us will be able to live in the world 100 years from now. So we've got to find a way to partner on that.
So, short answer on this one. What right now, given what you know and where we are, what's the likelihood in the next 10, 20 years that the Americans and the Chinese, in your view, end up at war? What's the percentage, roughly?
I'd say it's a realistic possibility. I'd say better than 20%.
Better than 20%.
Better than 20%.
So more than.
More than, I'm sorry.
Okay. So worse than
Worse
20%.
than.
Yeah. Okay.
Higher than 20%.
Okay.
And since, as we learned in the old Cold War, I mean, I'm an old Cold Warrior. That was my thing that I did most of my life. In the Cold War, a threat is likelihood times consequences. If the consequences are infinite, the difference between 20% and 50% are not very interesting.
Yeah. But then if the consequences are infinite, the difference between 20% and 0.01% aren't very interesting. So
That's right.
You could drive that too far.
So you got to work on driving it down to the lowest conceivable number, and you can try to work on the consequences too. Yeah.
I'm just saying multiplying by infinity is
Yeah.
something you generally don't want to do.
Absolutely.
But Kevin, how would you respond to all of that? How do you think about U.S.-China in the context of the way that Graham just framed the trap and the off-ramps?
Okay. Let me have a quick go at that, and we'll then throw it open to some questions from others. When I was at Harvard with Graham, I started thinking about this. This is before Trump, before trade wars, before anything else. And I started writing about this thing called constructive realism. Why do I use those terms? Just being realistic about the stuff the United States and China are never going to agree on because of values or conflicting interests. But being constructive about the stuff that you could cooperate on and the stuff you could actively agree on, and to frankly categorize the elements of the relationship accordingly into those kind of 3 broad boxes. This is not just an exercise in metaphysics, it's got some practical politics about it, which is think about any other international relationship which has gone from disastrous to manageable in history, or from manageable to better, let alone from better to good. For example, the evolution of the Anglo-American relationship over history. It's a bit like that. And so the virtue of kind of doing it that way is you, from the easier stuff that you cooperate on, you start to build up something called political capital, diplomatic capital. And then the harder stuff you do, in the case of US-China relationship, might be active collaboration on North Korean nuclear proliferation. Hard, overlapping but by no means identical strategic interests from China and the United States. But if you actually pulled it off, it would actually inject a whole new domain of political capital into the US-China relationship. And then does that give you enough political capital to deal with the longer term stuff, which is Thucydides, a la the relative change in the power balance between the two over time, as well as more immediate questions like conflicting values, political systems, plus Taiwan. Now that's an open question as to whether accumulated political capital can solve something as fundamentally structural as those, let's call it hard basket disagreements. On the hard basket, though, let me reinforce something Graham just said. And going back to Kennedy's concept of global diversity, if you can construct enough constraints around the hard basket, which has a mutual agreement not to go to terminal war with each other, which is the doctrine which emerged for the period of détente with the Soviets, certainly post-72, but still had a number of operational red lines around that in terms of if you guys, you Soviets, do X, Y, and Z in Africa or Latin America, rest assured you will know the price through what we do operationally elsewhere in the world, and you will feel it and know it. And that's kind of how it worked. And then at the same time, there was a kind of a grudging acceptance that at the end of the day, will this great ideology of socialism in one country, the Soviet Union, as a body of ideas, prevail against decadent American capitalism and liberal democracy on the other? Well, we know who won that war eventually. That is the West against that Soviet proposition. But in some respects, this is the challenge now of US-China, which is ultimately about value systems and ultimately about different constructs of politics and to some extent economics. And so if you can bring about a system which actually has a safeguard at the end of it, which says no one's going to push any terminal button, but frankly, if you muck up in theatre A, theatre B, theatre C, whether you're American or Chinese, then actions will ensue. And then C, to use a Chinese phrase, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend, by Hua Qifeng. Then let's just see what happens in the wonderful world out there, which set of ideas ultimately prevails in this global ideational battle. Now, I have a view myself as to who's more likely to prevail, but that might be an element which, or a framework which takes us through the truly wicked problem which your question has pointed to.
Challenging, but important. We have some time for some questions, and I'll first you. I assume we have mics running around. We do. We'll start here. We have a bunch of questions. If you can get through them quickly, then we'll have more of them. Please.
Johan Elias. Thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. I have a question for all of you. For me, the biggest prize in the negotiations with China is creating a level playing field, not the tariffs. Because it's such a huge market, and as you, Graham, pointed out, GDP there is going to explode. It's going to be the biggest economy in the world. And let's remember, China, with the exception of 150 years, China has always been the biggest economy in the world. Now, how do you see that, particularly to you, Kevin, who is an expert on this, how do you see that playing out? How long do you think it will take until we get a, say, 80% level playing field in China?
Let me try and answer that very briefly, because we'll get through a series of questions. It really hangs on the question of the Chinese Communist Party's and Xi Jinping's view of the right balance of China's domestic political economy. What do I mean by that? The eternal tussle post-79 in China domestically has been, I'm the Communist Party and I want to remain in power and control. Then Deng Xiaoping says, well, that doesn't work in the economy, I'm sorry very much. Mao tried that, and look what happened. It didn't work out so well. Okay, so we'll throw that open to the market. Roll the clock on 20 or 30 years, and the party says, whoops, we're starting to lose power and control. So we need to put some controls back on the economy. Some of the events of the last couple of years, we've seen that as the economic policy direction in China began to head left rather than right. The big dynamic for change domestically within China is its rising entrepreneurial class, who are demanding such radical things as competition policy, a level playing field domestically between private firms and state-owned enterprises.
Intellectual property.
Intellectual property protection, because we private entrepreneurs are innovating all this stuff in Shenzhen and the AI space and the other high-tech space, and you guys from the military are just going to march in and take it for free. Well, get lost. You know, it's not the way in which our market works. Oh, sorry, it's the party. I forgot about that. And so the biggest driver for change is not so much what President Trump is doing, although that in some respects accelerates the process. The biggest driver for change is the 60% of the economy now generated by the Chinese private sector, the 90% of new jobs each year in China generated by the private sector, and their growing systemic demands for a level playing field. What I don't know the answer to, Johan, is this: will they prevail? At the end of last year, Uncle Xi, by the time we got to November, said, you know, 天啊, 想不到. Sorry, didn't realize we're going to have this crisis of confidence on the part of the Chinese private sector. We really do love you. You've mistaken our warm embrace for strangulation. We want you to go out there and continue to fire away and generate new jobs, new enterprises, and new technologies. The open question is that tactical or strategic from the party's part? And will the Chinese private sector respond? The Chinese private sector's great ally in this process is international capital, because international capital wants the same level playing field with the Chinese as the Chinese domestic private sector want.
So we're going to go right in the back there. Before we do, when you're in the room, when you're in these G20 and other summit meetings with all the white guys and the Chinese president, how much does the fact that you know Chinese actually improve your ability to get messages through and create relations with him?
I don't know, because I've not seen my file in Beijing to know what it says about whether I'm a problem or not. I hope it basically records that I'm, on balance, a constructive problem for our Chinese friends. A problem in the sense that whenever the Chinese, frankly, have engaged in what I think is unhelpful, I tend to say that, privately or publicly, but I always try and come in with an answer as to how it might be handled. I think the only other thing is, to get anywhere at the Chinese leadership, you can get quite a way, I find, through robust private conversation. As soon as you get into the public domain, then what enters into play is mianzi, face not just for the person but for the party and for the country. And then your ability to actually craft an outcome when you've got public winners and public losers, China up, America down, China up, it gets much harder. So on balance, I could point to a few examples in the last 10 years where I may have had some minor contribution privately to resolving things involving the Chinese, and others where I've comprehensively failed. So it's a mixed bag.
I think just quickie, that basically, unfortunately for those of us who are ignorant of a foreign language, when you're in a discussion or negotiation and the people are coming from a different language, we miss a fantastic amount of nuance. When I used to negotiate with Soviets, I would always have somebody with me sitting in the back, listening carefully, and then afterwards I'd tell them, what did I miss of what was going on? It would be about half, yeah.
Sir.
Kevin Shanley of the Asian Society Policy Institute. And if I'm in Beijing and I'm looking at the United States and the rivalry, I'm wondering whether I wouldn't be vexed by the question of how do we peacefully manage the decline of the United States?
Well, I think I'll flip past that to Dr. Thucydides.
Oh, I think
Graham has a great line when China defines its own peaceful rise. He says, we Chinese will rise and you should be peaceful about it.
Chinese are extremely interested in the story of the rise of the U.S. and British accommodation. So they've studied that case a lot, and they think that's a good model for us. As they say, you know, Britain was ruled the world for 100 years. America rose, the tide receded, and Britain left your hemisphere. So they would say that's a, you know, study that model, that looks good from our perspective.
I think that the Chinese have been doing a pretty good job managing Russian decline. I mean, they treat Putin with incredible deference. They throw in great parties. You're so important, so want to work with you, while they're undermining them desperately in Central Asia and the Caucasus and everything else. And I think, personally, I think it was a big mistake that when Xi Jinping comes out and says we're going to dominate, you know, the world in AI by 2030. No. I mean, treat the Americans as if we are still as powerful as we want to think we are. I think that's what they should do. Whether someone like Xi Jinping, who gets rid of term limits, is prepared to do that, I think is an open question. That's going to be kind of interesting.
Final thought on that is the big doubt in the back of the Chinese mind is this about America's future, and that is the capacity demonstrated from the historical record of the United States to continue to reinvent itself, both in its economics, its technology, and its finance, and as well as its military and the rest. And this ultimately is not quantifiable in a neat Chinese analytical model. Now, militating against that is the sheer, let's call it, question of scale. But let's just go to the scale question for a minute. China's own date with demographic destiny, where does that land China over time? Secondly, despite recent complications in the United States, if you look at your broader NAFTA, assuming it goes back to being that, I mean, this is an entity in North America of 500 million people. You got how many people in this country? 320 million?
340.
340 million. How many people in Mexico? 100 million?
Almost, yeah.
And you've got a few Canadians. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah.
37,206,000. And so round that out.
There's another one born today, yeah.
Yeah. No, to round that out, this is a sophisticated integrated economy, notwithstanding all the public circus that we've had on the NAFTA question the last 12 months. So you've got 500 million people against what by mid-century may be a billion Chinese as the population curve rounds.
So do we
down.
count Australia in the NAFTA totals or the China totals?
Depends how nice you are to me in the meantime. And, I think given how in-your-face Australians are, I think we'll always be, shall we say, more at home in the Western community of nations.
Question right there. And we have a cadet there, is that right?
Congratulations,
Yes,
Kevin. And this is a question for you and for Professor Allison. And given the taxonomy of relationships you gave, relationships that could be made better, relationships that you kind of write off, how would you describe the prognosis for our relationship with Russia? And to what extent does the U.S.'s relationship to Russia depend on our own domestic policy? And what advice would you give us to manage it better, if at all?
I think what I'll do is hospital pass that straight to Graham because he's the, is that a Hail Mary pass or a hospital pass? It's different. Australian English, a hospital pass is, I've got the ball, there's a big guy coming down towards me, he's going to crush me to death. I'm giving you the ball so that you go to hospital rather than me.
It's a
lateral.
A rugby line.
Okay.
So your question is a good question. I think the American politics are the biggest driver of our policy towards Russia today, not our interests. The politics that are caught up around Russia's participation in the 2016 election, Trump's strange behavior with respect to Russia, and this being such a juicy target for Democrats that they can't let loose of it. And I'm a Democrat. Okay, so it's just too sweet a target, even though in terms of our interest, if China's rise is a problem to be managed, Russia should in principle feel, and in terms of its interest, feel worried about that a lot and should become more aligned with the U.S. if you're doing just the geopolitics of the matter. But I think partly because of our mishandling of policy, partly because of the politics, partly because, as Ian said, Xi Jinping has been brilliant about this in managing his relationship with Putin. That's now become it's almost functionally an alliance. I wrote a piece in the January National Interest on the topic, in which I went and did a systematic look at what's actually going on. It's pretty shocking, and the Chinese hand in this has been brilliantly played.
I also think partially because Russia's a kleptocracy that invades neighboring countries, and
What do you really think about Russia?
Exactly. I take your point. No, this grand strategy piece that implies that we should be better
but your
Russia.
point is certainly right. When Xi and Putin get together, they can both agree that the U.S. is an existential threat to their rulership, because we are trying to undermine authoritarian, communist, whatever regimes, and we would seek, if we could, to change those governments. Excuse me, that's what Congress writes legislation about all the time. So they can tell a lot of stories to each other about how, quote, we are undermining their, quote, legitimate authoritarian one-man ruled regime.
No, the only thing I'm pushing back on is the notion. I mean, look at Obama and you look at Trump, and then you look at the French and the Brits and the Germans, and a lot of them have very legitimate reasons to be disturbed about the role that the Russians have been playing, both domestically as well. It's hard to quickly get past that to say, let's embrace grand Russian alliance to undermine the Chinese. So it's a challenge, but I take the point very strongly. We have a cadet who has a question, and the final one will go to our chair. Yeah.
Cadet Haseman, thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Rudd, you mentioned earlier China's population leveling off. Do you feel that might be a factor, this kind of looming demographic crunch, in maybe a slowing of China's rise over the next several decades?
I think, by the way, to all of our friends from West Point, welcome. Good to have you here. At the Asian Society Policy Institute, we've had interns from West Point with us last year. I go out there each year and talk to either the cadets or to conferences. So it's just up the river here, so it's all very close. So it's good to have you with us today. I think your question's really important for this reason. There is a grave temptation, those of us sitting here in the United States and elsewhere in the collective West, to simply make linear projections about China's future. If we just freeze frame our thinking at this point of our discussion today on China and put ourselves in the imaginary position of being in a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Politburo in Beijing, all 7 of them, guys who usually wear the same color ties and suits. One
who now has some gray hair.
One who now has some gray hair. The conversation is actually of a different nature. The conversation is usually about what they feel most vulnerable about domestically. Challenges to the party's authority. Secondly, can we afford the BRI? It's a huge call on the Chinese budget and capital resources. Thirdly, have we overreached in terms of international reaction to some of the things we've been doing? Fourthly, the economy question, which I sought to address in response to Johan's question before, which is what's the best balance of political economy? I've got to continue to liberalise the market, to grow the economy, to increase living standards, to reduce poverty. At the same time, all these private entrepreneurs are leading that charge, and I'm incrementally losing grip of my control of the country through the Communist Party. This is a rolling dilemma for this leadership. And then you've got the big ones on demography, which are structural, which is not just Chinese labour market began shrinking in size 2 years ago. It's actually peaked in absolute size. The actual population is likely to peak by the end of the coming decade. And the demographers disagree on where it will land by mid-century. But within that, the aging of the Chinese population, China is actually aging more quickly than my country, Australia. Now, the reason we're not aging as much is we've got a very big migration program. But the bottom line is the aging of the population means you've got this exploding aged care responsibility, healthcare responsibility, in order to preserve what the Communist Party is really ultimately very anxious about, which is social stability. So therefore, this is a huge drain on budget as well. And China is running a very significant systemic budget deficit over time. So therefore, ultimately, there are budget realities which proceed from the demographic challenge as well. So all I say is, if you're sitting around the Chinese leadership circle, this stuff looms very large indeed. And we should be mindful, therefore, of China's own perception of its own national challenges when we reflect on the challenges of this country going forward as well. As I said in response to the chap up the back there before, you know, as one of your friends and allies over a long period of time, people like us in Australia, we've seen you guys sort of invent and reinvent yourselves. You do some really crazy things in this country, but we do too in Australia. That's kind of what democracies do.
So
but you can reinvent yourselves.
last question, please.
Thank you. Kevin, I wanted to follow up on the comment you made about building up political capital as we try to find common ground for U.S. and China. I wonder if, in addition to political capital, there are ways in which we can build up cumulative goodwill through economic endeavors, business partnerships. Perhaps where China is faltering, the U.S. could be supportive. Perhaps in areas where both countries have major challenges, such as in healthcare, cancer, pollution, that we can find ways in which we can join together.
That's a great question, Lulu. All I'd say in response to that is, when you look at the potential resolution of the trade war between the United States and China, that's going to improve things to some extent in traded goods and to some extent traded services. It will also potentially have an impact in terms of the openness of the Chinese market, not just to American, but international investment. And in other words, also create a new level of what I describe as economic interdependency. I think one of the things which I wish could have been concluded under the Obama administration, but which wasn't, not criticizing anyone in particular for that, was the Bilateral Investment Treaty, the BIT. And the reason why that's so important in the scheme of things is it's investment which ultimately kind of ties economies. Traded goods and to some extent traded services bounce in, bounce out, but do they affect, however, indigenous sentiment in both countries towards each other? No. But when you've got deeply ingrained investment relationships, frankly, that takes it to a new level. The other thing I see happening, Lulu, is not much in the newspapers, but the new set of financial market reforms the Chinese have brought in the last 12 months and accelerated toward the end of last year. The fact that greater foreign investment, it will now be allowed in Chinese equities markets, bonds markets, the development of China's futures markets, dominant foreign-controlled enterprises now as banks, insurance companies, and as brokerage firms. And the reverse, as it potentially will apply, I hope, in countries, in this country as well, is that actually also begins to change the fabric of the, let's call it the interconnectedness over time. So you put these three beasts together, capital markets, foreign direct investment plus trade, it can create a much bigger economic ballast in the relationship which has been missing. But here's the cautionary tale, which Captain Thucydides will reinforce. And that is, when you reflect on World War I, which Graham has said to his classes in Harvard, no one can ever overstudy in terms of understanding the factors giving rise to an utterly avoidable war, which was the First World War. Is that in 1914, the level of economic interdependency between France, Britain and Germany was as big as it is today and didn't prevent a war. So, but that doesn't mean we walk away from that level of interconnectedness as creating a new set of, shall I say, constraining mechanisms against, let's call it the political and security class, rolling us down other railway tracks towards, quote, an inevitable war. I think this is where we can do more.
So I promised everyone would be out of here at 2:30. It's 2:30. But if you'd please join me, Professor Graham Allison, Honorable Kevin Rudd. Thank them very, very much.
Let me add my thanks to Ian's comments. It's been a wonderful gathering, and I must say, read the book. It's a fabulous book, and I thought one of the most wonderful parts of it was when Therese asked Kevin, Therese is Kevin's wife, wonderful woman, if after this brilliant and bruising career, if he would do it again, and he said, absolutely. And I think we need to thank people like Kevin, who've been public servants, who've done tremendous service for the world, not only to his country, and who continues to believe that democracy is a brilliant system, and that if we can bring the hopes and benefits of democracy to the many, that we can keep it vital. So there is a great deal of inspiration, this optimism in the book, and I think his values are shared by our other speakers, Allison and Ian. Thank you so much for joining us all today.
Thank you both of you.
That was fun.